Welcome to the deep dive. We both know you guys are here because you really want to get to the heart of something, without drowning in a sea of information.
Yeah. Yeah.
And today's no different, right? We're tackling a question I bet almost everyone listening has thought about at some point. Why do some people just seem to have this knack for languages,
Yeah.
while others, well, it feels like they're swimming upstream?
Absolutely.
And you guys have been so clear you want those aha moments, those light bulb moments, without getting lost in the weeds. So just think of this as your fast track to understanding all those fascinating ways people differ when they're trying to learn a new language.
Yeah, we've really dug deep into this one, haven't we? I mean, we're talking research, studies, surveys, theoretical frameworks, the
Sure.
whole shebang, all from the world of second language acquisition.
And I've got to say, this is a pretty meaty topic,
Oh, it is.
but that's exactly why we're here. Right?
Right.
We're zeroing in on what makes each learner, uniquely them, and how all those quirks and traits shape their journey as they grapple with a new language. Our mission today is to sift through all of that and extract the purest gold, the nuggets of wisdom that'll help you walk away thinking, okay, now I get it, Why some people seem to just breeze through language learning and what's really going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. If you've ever felt like you're pushing that proverbial boulder uphill while someone else is just, gliding along effortlessly,
Yeah.
we're going to break down why that happens.
Well, let's unpack this thing. All right, so picture this. Almost every kid picks up their first language like it's nothing.
It really is incredible, isn't it?
It's like built in, right? Nearly all of us just do it.
Yeah.
But then you look at adults or even teens learning a second language, and it's a whole different ball game.
Totally different.
Some people take off like a rocket, while others just, they hit these roadblocks.
Yeah. And you can't help but wonder, right, what's the deal with that?
Right. And that contrast, between that almost guaranteed success with our first language and then the roller coaster of outcomes when it comes to a second language, that's where it gets really interesting.
It is. It really sets the stage for all these assumptions people make, like, oh, extroverts are just natural-born language learners.
Yeah.
Or you've either got the language gene or you don't.
Right,
Or,
yeah.
if you're not crazy motivated, you might as well forget it.
That's a big one.
And, of course, the age-old classic, the younger you start, the better.
Oh, yeah, that one's everywhere. And I think what's so cool about this deep dive is that we get to peel back the layers on those ideas and see what the research actually says.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's not as simple as just asking people a few questions on a survey, is it?
No way.
And you really step back and look at the whole picture, studying individual differences like this. It's surprisingly complex.
I can imagine.
Like, how do you really get a grip on something as slippery as motivation?
Yeah.
It's not like measuring your height or your weight, right? We have to rely on what people tell us, what they do, and then try to piece together what's going on inside their heads.
It's all about those internal drivers, but those drivers, they don't just exist in a vacuum, right? It's like they're all tangled up together.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's say someone says, I'm super motivated to practice my new language outside of class. Okay, but what if they just happen to live in a neighborhood where they bump into native speakers, like, every day?
Yeah.
Is it really their ironclad motivation leading to all that practice? Or is it the fact that they've got these opportunities just falling into their lap? And maybe all that practice makes them seem more motivated.
It's chicken and egg, isn't it?
It really is. You can't always disentangle those threads neatly.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's not just about what's going on in the learner's head either, right? It's like the way we even measure how well someone knows a language can actually skew what we find out about them.
That's such a crucial point.
Yeah.
What do we even mean by successful language learning? Are we talking about perfect grammar, effortless conversation about anything under the sun, something else entirely? Different tests zero in on different skills.
Totally.
So you could have a study using a super grammar-heavy test that finds a strong link between that kind of aptitude and success, right? But then another study that's all about how well people can actually chat in real-life situations might find that personality or confidence is way more important.
So how we even define what it means to be good at a language really shapes what we discover about individual differences.
It does, yeah.
And just because we see a pattern, like, oh, hey, learners who seem really driven tend to do better, that doesn't automatically mean their drive is what caused them to do better.
A classic correlation versus causation conundrum. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one is making the other happen. Maybe someone had some early success with the language and that fueled their motivation. Or maybe they've got this hidden natural talent that makes learning easier, which then leads to both success and more motivation.
And there could be some other hidden factor we haven't even thought about that's pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the learner in isolation either, right? Their whole environment, the context where they're learning, can have a huge impact.
Right, it's not happening in a bubble.
No, not at all. Even someone with all those personal traits we typically associate with success, they could still hit a wall if their social or educational setting doesn't give them many chances to actually use the language in real life situations.
Right.
Think about groups who might experience marginalization or discrimination.
Yeah.
They might have the desire, they might even have some aptitude, but they face these real barriers to practicing and improving.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The work of folks like Norton and Toohey really highlights how those social and educational factors can hold people back, even if they look like they should be thriving on paper.
It's a good reminder that every learner is part of a bigger picture, a social context.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork here. Individual differences, they're a big deal, they're messy, and they're totally woven into the fabric of second language learning.
Totally.
But let's zoom in a bit now on some specific characteristics,
Yeah.
starting with aptitude. What exactly does that mean when we talk about language learning aptitude?
Well, one of the pioneers in this area, John Carroll, he defined aptitude pretty simply as the ability to learn quickly.
Okay.
So the idea is some people just have this knack for picking up languages faster than others.
Right.
It's not saying that someone with lower aptitude can't succeed.
Right.
It just means they might need more time and more deliberate effort.
Makes sense. So how do we even go about trying to measure this knack?
Yeah.
I've heard of these aptitude tests. You're right, there are tests. And for years, the gold standard was the Modern Language Aptitude Test, or MLAT.
Oh, yeah, the MLAT.
And then there's the Pimsleur Language Aptitude Battery, the PLAB. And they were built on this idea that language aptitude is made up of several core abilities. Things like being able to hear and remember new sounds, understanding the grammar of a sentence, figuring out the rules of a language from examples, and good old-fashioned vocabulary memorization.
So it sounds like those tests were pretty focused on grammar and vocab then.
That's a really important point to keep in mind.
Yeah.
These tests were developed back when language teaching was often all about grammar translation and these repetitive audiolingual drills.
Yeah.
But then language teaching started shifting towards more communicative approaches, where the emphasis was on actually using the language to, communicate.
Right. Actually having conversations.
Exactly. And that's when some people started asking whether those same aptitude components were still the best way to predict who would succeed.
That's interesting. So if you're spending most of your class time actually talking and interacting, does being a grammar whiz on a test really tell you how well you're going to do?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
But some research suggests that even in those more communicative settings, some aspects of aptitude, especially that ability to analyze language, to really see the patterns and structures, that still seems to play a big role.
Interesting.
For example, there's this study by Ranta looking at kids in an ESL program that had very little explicit grammar instruction. And they found that the kids who were good at analyzing language, they were the ones who learned the most.
So it's not just about memorizing lists of words anymore, which is what I always kind of pictured when I thought about aptitude,
Right, you're spot on. The thinking has definitely evolved, and it's moved away from rote memorization as the be-all and end-all of aptitude.
Okay.
Now, there's a lot more emphasis on working memory capacity.
Yeah.
You can think of working memory as your brain's short-term juggling act. How much information you can hold and manipulate at once. And research is increasingly suggesting that this might be super crucial for all sorts of things in language learning.
So someone with good working memory can basically juggle more new stuff at the same time, like new words, grammar rules, pronunciation, all while trying to understand and speak in real time.
Exactly. And researchers like Dowdy and her team are even developing aptitude tests, specifically for more advanced learners.
Oh, wow.
Looking at different types of memory that might be important at that stage. Things like phonological memory for sound, short-term memory for sequences, associative memory for linking words and meanings, and even long-term memory consolidation. It seems like even within memory, there are all these different players that contribute to different parts of language learning.
So it's not just one single talent, it's more like a toolbox of different cognitive skills.
Yeah, I like that analogy, and that actually aligns with the thinking of someone like Skahan. He suggests that successful learners don't necessarily have to be superstars in every area of aptitude.
Oh, that's interesting.
One person might have an amazing working memory, but be just okay at consciously dissecting grammar rules right, while someone else might be a natural at grammar but have a less impressive working memory.
Yeah.
And those different strengths might actually make them better suited to different styles of teaching.
Which makes me think about how we teach, right? If learners have these different cognitive profiles, maybe we should be tailoring our teaching methods to match those strengths.
Precisely. Robinson has been a big advocate for that idea. He argues that instruction is likely to be way more effective if it lines up with learners' individual cognitive strength.
Right.
And there was this really neat study by Vesh with adult French learners that provides some compelling evidence. She actually matched students who had high analytical abilities with grammar-focused instruction and students with good memory skills with more communicative classes.
Wow, so she really customized it.
Yeah, and what she found was that those students in the matched groups, they were more satisfied and they
Yeah.
learned better.
That makes a lot of sense. If your brain is wired a certain way, learning in a style that clicks with that could give you a real boost. Okay, but realistically, in a classroom with a bunch of students, each with their own strengths, how do you even begin to cater to all those individual needs?
That is the million-dollar question for teachers, right?
Yeah.
Fully individualized instruction for every single learner. It's a logistical nightmare in most classrooms.
Yeah.
But Wesch's findings suggest that teachers should at least aim to mix things up in their lessons.
Yeah.
Incorporate a bunch of different activities and teaching approaches to try and reach a broader range of aptitude profiles.
Right. Cater to that diversity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's another study that backs this up by Earlham with high school French students.
Okay.
She looked at 3 different types of grammar instruction. Deductive, where you explicitly teach the rules. Inductive, where students kind of figure out the rules from examples, and structured input, where they see lots of examples but don't necessarily have to produce the language right away.
So 3 very different approaches. Did one of them turn out to be the magic bullet for everyone?
It's funny you should say that because actually she found that all the learners, regardless of their aptitude, seemed to benefit from that deductive, more explicit grammar instruction,
Interesting.
which supports Skehan's idea that a more structured approach can kind of level the playing field a bit.
Mm.
But she also found that learners with stronger analytical abilities and better memories tended to do better with the inductive and structured input methods, at least on written grammar tests.
So those with higher aptitude in those areas might be better at picking up patterns and solidifying their knowledge just from exposure without needing explicit rules or having to produce it right away.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe a blend of different approaches is the way to go in the classroom.
Makes sense. Now, what about the language itself? Does aptitude play a different role depending on whether you're learning a language that's relatively similar to your own or one that's wildly different and has a ton of tricky features?
That's a great question. And De Keyser has actually looked into this. He did a study with Turkish learners of English, and he focused on how well they learned 2 different grammatical features.
Mm-hmm.
The past progressive tense, which is generally considered easier for Turkish speakers,
Okay.
and the passive voice, which is notoriously tougher.
Right.
And he found that a learner's ability to figure out grammar rules that was linked to how well they learned the harder passive voice, but not so much to their learning of the easier past progressive, at least on a written test. On the flip side, their memory skills seem to matter more for learning the past progressive on a speaking task.
So it's like different tools in your aptitude toolbox become more important depending on what you're trying to learn.
Exactly.
Okay, before we wrap up aptitude, I'm curious about those outliers,
Mhm.
We've all heard those stories about people who are super smart and do great in other subjects, but just can't seem to grasp languages.
Yeah, those cases are fascinating. Gancho and Sparks have actually done research on these individuals, and they found that they often score lower on at least some parts of aptitude tests, and sometimes they even have some underlying verbal skill challenges in their first language.
So it's not just about overall intelligence, there's something else going on.
Exactly. But the important message is that with the right support and focused effort, these learners can still succeed.
That's encouraging. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are those almost mythical polyglot savants who seem to pick up languages like it's breathing, even if their other cognitive or social skills might be more limited.
Those are some truly intriguing cases,
Okay.
and researchers like Obler-Smith and Simply have documented some of these stories. Their work suggests that aptitude might be at least partly a separate skill set from other cognitive or social abilities.
So it's not just a byproduct of being generally intelligent.
Right, but it's important to remember that even these super talented learners often put in a ton of hard work. It's not all just effortless talent.
Right. Even those with natural gifts still have to put in the time. Okay, so aptitude definitely plays a role, can give you a head start or a natural advantage, but it's definitely not the whole story. Hard work, the right strategies, and a supportive environment, they all matter a lot too.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears now from what we can do to who we are and talk about personality. How does that factor into the language learning journey? I mean, it's a pretty common belief that extroverts have a natural edge, right?
Yeah, you hear that a lot, don't you?
Hmm.
But the research on the link between personality traits and second language learning, it's not quite so clear-cut. The findings have been a bit all over the place.
Okay.
For example, while some studies have found a connection between language success and traits, often associated with extroversion,
Hmm.
things like assertiveness or risk-taking.
Right, being willing to put yourself out there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Other studies haven't found that same link. Some successful learners are actually quite introverted. In fact, Wong Fillmore, she observed young learners and found that quiet, more observant kids sometimes thrived.
That makes sense. Maybe in a less pressured setting where they have more time to process before they have to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So extroversion might not be the golden ticket we sometimes make it out to be.
Okay. So what about anxiety? That feels like a big one.
It's huge, right? Learner anxiety, that feeling of nervousness, worry, stress, specifically when you're trying to use the language. That's been studied extensively.
Right.
Earlier research tended to view anxiety as a fixed personality trait, something you just had more or less of. But newer research suggests it's much more dynamic. It can change depending on the situation.
So you might be terrified to give a presentation in the new language, but perfectly comfortable chatting with a few friends.
Exactly. And anxiety can really get in the way of learning, can't it?
Yeah.
If you're constantly worried about messing up or sounding silly, you might not even open your mouth to practice.
Yeah, you're too afraid to even try.
McIntyre, who's a leading researcher in this area, he argues that students with high anxiety, they're not just focused on the task. They're also hyper-aware of their own reactions, their apprehension, and that can totally distract them.
So it's like a double whammy, you know?
Exactly. But here's the interesting thing. Some research actually suggests that a little bit of anxiety, a bit of tension, that can actually be helpful.
Oh, really?
It's kind of like those pretest jitters, you know?
Yeah.
It can give you an extra push to focus and try harder.
So a little pressure can be a good thing, but too much can totally paralyze you.
It's all about finding that sweet spot, isn't it?
Exactly. What about our willingness to actually use the language, though? That feels pretty fundamental to me.
That's where willingness to communicate, where WTC comes in.
WTC.
Okay, we've all been there, right?
Right, yeah.
Avoiding chances to speak a new language, even though we knew it would be good for us, just because we felt shy or uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And a person's willingness to communicate it can go up and down, depending on who they're talking to, the topic, how formal the situation is, even just how tired they're feeling.
So many factors.
Right. And there's this funny story I heard recently about this guy who kept dodging the one French-speaking shopkeeper in his neighborhood every single time.
Oh,
Because he just wasn't feeling it.
I can totally relate to that. So what influences our willingness to actually put ourselves out there and speak?
Clement and McIntyre have a model that suggests it boils down to communicative confidence, which has two main ingredients: how relaxed you feel and how competent you think you are.
Okay.
And both of those are shaped by your past experiences with speakers of that language. Good experiences boost your confidence. Bad experiences do the opposite.
So creating a positive and supportive environment in the classroom is super important.
Absolutely. Yashima did some research in Japanese university EFL classrooms and found that when learners knew the topic of conversation and the speaking task felt safe and structured, their willingness to communicate shot up.
So knowing what to expect can really make a difference.
Big time. And here's another interesting tidbit. They found a correlation between how willing someone is to communicate in their first language and their willingness to communicate in their second.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you're a chatty person in general, you're probably more likely to at least try, even if you're not feeling super confident.
Yeah, that's the idea. So personality is definitely in the mix, but it's more complicated than just saying extroverts are better.
It's all about the nuances. What about other personality traits that researchers have looked at, things like self-esteem or empathy?
Those have been on the radar, but the research hasn't really found any strong, clear-cut links to overall language learning success. Some researchers think personality might be more connected to how well someone develops conversational skills rather than their grammar or academic language.
Interesting.
And we have to remember, personality is super complex. A questionnaire might not capture the whole picture. More qualitative research could be helpful here.
Right, like actually observing people in real life settings. Okay, so personality plays a role, but maybe not as straightforward as we thought. Let's talk about attitudes and motivation now. I mean, it seems pretty logical that if you have a good attitude towards the language and the people who speak it, you're probably going to be more motivated to learn it right.
That's the intuition. And Gardner's research really points to a strong connection between positive attitudes towards the target language community and success in learning.
Okay.
Now, proving a direct cause and effect relationship is tricky.
Right, because there could be other factors?
Exactly. But there's a lot of evidence that learners with positive attitudes are just more willing to keep learning and engage with the language and its speakers.
They stick with it.
Yeah, they do. And motivation itself, it's not just an on-off switch, is it? There are different flavors of motivation.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
Right. So way back when Gardner and Lambert, these pioneers in the field, they talked about instrumental motivation, which is learning a language for practical reasons like getting a better job.
Right.
And integrative motivation, which is more about connecting with the culture and the people.
Okay, so one is more external and one is more personal.
Exactly. And for a while, people thought integrative motivation was the key to long-term success.
Really?
Yeah. But more recent research shows that both types can work depending on the learner and the context.
Interesting.
Plus, the lines between them can get blurry in real life.
Yeah.
And as you said, motivation isn't static. It can ebb and flow.
Oh, I know that feeling. I've definitely had times when I was super gung-ho about learning something new, and then that initial excitement just kind of fizzled out.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
And to capture this dynamic nature of motivation, Dornier came up with this process-oriented model. He breaks it down into 3 phases.
Okay.
Choice motivation, which is about getting started and setting goals. Executive motivation, which is all about keeping up the effort and using the right strategies.
Okay.
And then motivation retrospection, which is looking back and evaluating your progress, how you deal with the ups and downs.
So it's like a continuous cycle.
Exactly. Dornier uses this great example of a Polish student learning Spanish to illustrate how learners move through these phases and how their experiences shape their motivation along the way.
I like that. And the classroom environment, that must play a huge role too, right? Especially for students who maybe don't have a strong external reason to learn the language.
Oh, absolutely. Teachers have so much power here. Creating a classroom where students feel engaged and the content feels relevant, where goals are challenging but achievable, and where there's a supportive vibe. All of that feeds into motivation.
It's like setting the stage for success.
Exactly. And teachers also need to be sensitive to cultural and age differences.
Yeah.
You know, what motivates one student might not do a thing for another.
It's all about being attuned to your students. So are there specific things teachers can do to boost motivation in the classroom?
There are. Guillotot and Dornier actually studied this, and they identified specific motivational teaching practices.
Okay, like what?
Things like sparking curiosity, giving students choices, clearly explaining why activities are important, using group work, designing fun tasks, and giving effective praise. Things that make students feel good about their progress.
Right, build that confidence.
Yeah, exactly. And the research found that teachers who regularly used these practices had more engaged students who reported higher motivation.
So it's not just about the individual's motivation, it's about what the teacher does to cultivate it.
It's a partnership.
And it seems like motivation can even change from minute to minute during a lesson, right?
Oh, totally. Researchers have actually used something called a motometer to track students' motivation levels in real time.
A motometer. Wow.
And they found that motivation can fluctuate like crazy, even within a single lesson. A long, boring grammar explanation might cause it to plummet, while a fun, interactive task might send it soaring.
That makes sense.
And this fits with the idea of complex dynamic systems theory, which basically says motivation isn't this stable trait. It emerges from the interplay of tons of different factors.
So keeping things fresh and engaging in the classroom isn't just about catering to different learning styles. It's about keeping that motivational fire burning.
It's like tending a garden, you know? You got to keep things interesting and give it the right conditions to thrive.
Okay, we've talked about those internal factors like aptitude and personality, and we've talked about motivation and attitudes. But now let's zoom out a bit and think about how those bigger social and cultural forces can shape language learning. Things like a learner's identity and how they see themselves in relation to the language and its speakers.
This is such a critical layer to consider because the power dynamics between languages in a society can really influence a learner's whole experience.
Yeah, I can see that.
Think about it as someone from a minority language group learning the dominant language of a country. They're going to have a very different journey compared to someone from the dominant group learning a minority language just for fun.
Totally different stakes.
Right. And Norton's idea of investment really helps us unpack this. She did research with immigrant women in Canada learning English.
Okay.
And she argues that those traditional ideas of instrumental and integrative motivation, they don't capture the whole picture. Investment gets at how a learner's identity is tied to their social world
Okay.
and how their desire to speak the language is influenced by their sense of belonging, their perceived value in social situations, and the benefits they expect from learning.
So even if you're motivated in the traditional sense, you might still hold back if you feel like there's a power imbalance or you're not being respected.
Exactly. And that can really limit your opportunities to practice.
Right, because you're not putting yourself out there.
Exactly. And Toohey has these amazing observations from kindergarten classrooms.
Mm.
She saw how quickly kids get labeled as good or bad learners, ESL students.
Yeah.
And those labels can really impact how they participate and the chances they get to learn.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
It can be.
Yeah.
So creating inclusive and equitable learning environments, that's not just a feel-good thing. It directly impacts how well kids learn.
It's about creating a space where everyone feels valued. What about when learners feel a conflict between their own cultural identity and the culture of the target language?
That's a real challenge, especially when the target language is associated with a culture that feels very different from your own. For example, there have been observations of Japanese students who are motivated to learn English, but hesitant to speak it, maybe because they're worried about how their peers will see them.
That's interesting. So they might even avoid sounding too fluent.
Some might, yeah. A study by Tomita found that these students were more willing to communicate in activities that combined grammar and meaningful conversation, because talking about grammar let them hold on to that learner identity.
So it's about finding that balance between wanting to communicate well and wanting to stay true to yourself.
And this leads us to the idea of learner agency,
Okay.
which is basically recognizing that learners aren't just empty vessels. They have a say in their own learning.
Right. They're not just passive recipients.
No, they're active participants.
Yeah.
It's about giving them choices, letting them set goals, explore different strategies, and even have input on the content and methods.
Even if you can't personalize everything for every student, giving them some control can make a huge difference.
It really can, and technology is opening up a lot of opportunities for learners to take charge outside the classroom, too.
Right, like choosing what they want to learn and how they want to learn it. That ties back to motivation nicely. Okay, let's talk about learning styles and learner beliefs now. This is something that comes up all the time. We hear about visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners. Is there actually solid research to support tailoring teaching to those styles?
That's a great question. The idea of learning styles is definitely popular in education.
Right.
We've all heard people say, oh, I'm a visual learner, or I'm an auditory learner.
Right.
But the hard scientific evidence to support teaching to specific learning styles in a really rigid way, that's actually pretty limited.
Interesting.
It's tough to tell whether those preferences are truly how people learn best, or if they're just habits, or what feels comfortable.
Right. Maybe they've just always learned a certain way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even though the science might not be rock solid, it's still a good idea to pay attention to what learners say they prefer.
Yeah, you don't want to completely ignore their preferences.
Right. If someone finds it really helpful to see things written down, give them visual aids, the best approach is probably to use a mix of methods in the classroom to reach different learners in different ways.
So it's about variety and flexibility rather than putting people in boxes.
Exactly.
Right.
And then there's the question of what learners believe about language learning itself.
Right, like their own personal theories about how it all works.
Exactly. And those beliefs can have a big impact. Older learners especially, they often come in with strong opinions about what good teaching looks like.
And those opinions don't always match up with what teachers are doing.
That's right. Research has shown this disconnect between students and teachers when it comes to things like grammar instruction and error correction.
Okay.
Students often want more explicit grammar teaching and more correction than many teachers think is helpful. Lowen's research dug into this and found some interesting patterns. For example, ESL learners who are constantly exposed to English outside of class, they tended to value formal grammar instruction less than foreign language learners who might not have as much exposure.
Okay.
And corrective feedback on errors. Most groups value that less than explicit grammar instruction, except for learners of languages that are really different from English, like Chinese or Arabic.
Because maybe those languages have more complex grammar that feels harder to figure out on your own.
That could be part of it. And Spada looked at whether learners preferred grammar to be taught separately or integrated into communicative practice and found that most people preferred integration. But ESL learners valued that separate focus a bit more, probably reflecting their different learning contexts.
Right. It all comes back to context.
And what was interesting was that teachers often shared their students' beliefs about grammar.
So understanding those beliefs and preferences can help bridge that gap between teachers and students.
Absolutely can lead to more effective and more enjoyable learning for everyone.
Okay, we've covered a ton of ground here, exploring all these different individual differences. How should all of this inform what actually happens in the classroom? It seems like a pretty tall order for teachers to try to cater to so many different needs and preferences.
It's definitely a challenge, but the key takeaway is to be aware of this diversity and to consciously offer a variety of learning opportunities.
Right, it's about having that flexibility.
Exactly. An approach that sticks rigidly to one method or one type of activity is probably going to leave some learners behind.
So it's about providing a diverse menu of options rather than trying to fit everyone into a specific learning style box.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And teachers can also help learners become more aware of their own learning processes and help them develop a more flexible set of learning strategies.
Right, so learners can take ownership of their own learning.
Exactly. Encourage them to experiment, to reflect on what works best for them, and to build up that toolbox of strategies.
Okay, for our final deep dive into individual differences, let's tackle the big one, age. It's such a widespread belief that when it comes to language learning, younger is always unequivocally better.
It really is, but the relationship between age and language learning is actually way more nuanced than that, and it's still a hot topic among researchers.
Okay, so let's break it down. We often see that kids who move to a new country seem to pick up the language so easily while their parents might struggle.
That's a common observation.
But then we also know adults who have become incredibly fluent.
Exactly. So it's clearly not as simple as younger is always better.
So what about the critical period hypothesis? That idea that there's this window of time in childhood when the brain is like a sponge for language, and after that it becomes much harder?
The critical period hypothesis in its purest form suggests that there's this biological window ending around puberty, maybe even earlier, where the brain is primed for language learning. The idea is that after this period, learning a new language relies more on general cognitive skills and conscious strategies, which might not be as efficient or lead to that same level of automaticity.
So it's like the difference between instinct and deliberate effort.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some researchers even propose that there might be multiple critical periods for different aspects of language, like maybe pronunciation has an earlier and narrower window than vocabulary.
But we also have to remember that the learning conditions for kids and adults are so vastly different.
Oh, absolutely. Kids in immersion settings, they have so much exposure, way less pressure to be perfect, and their mistakes are seen as cute.
Right, they get away with a lot more.
Yeah, whereas adults, especially in classrooms, they face higher expectations, they need to express more complex ideas from the get-go, and they can feel way more self-conscious about messing up.
It's a totally different ballgame. So it's really hard to disentangle age from all those other factors.
It really is.
Yeah.